To understand the explosion that would clothe the world and forge the modern economy, we must first look back to a quieter time. Before the roar of the factories and the black smoke of Manchester, the textile industry of the early 1700s was defined by a slow, ancient rhythm. It was a world where production was intimate, local, and fundamentally limited by the speed of the human hand. In the rolling hills of rural Britain, specifically in counties like Lancashire, the putting-out system reigned supreme. This was not an industry of giant buildings, but of small, stone cottages. Imagine a family gathering in the evening light. The process was entirely domestic. Merchants would travel from village to village, delivering raw materials, primarily wool or flax, to these households. Inside these homes, the division of labor was dictated by tradition and muscle memory. The women and children were the spinners. They would sit by the hearth, often working late into the night, painstakingly turning raw fibers into yarn using simple spinning wheels. It was a slow, meditative process that required immense patience. Once the yarn was spun, it was passed to the men. The men were the weavers, operating large wooden hand looms that dominated the main living space of the cottage. They would throw the shuttle back and forth by hand, weaving the yarn a cloth, inch by inch. This was a life of independence. These workers controlled their own hours. They paused to tend to their gardens or care for their children. They lived by the sun, not the clock. But this system, while stable, had a fatal flaw. It was finite. The output was capped by the sheer physical limitations of the human body. While British families wove wool in their cottages, a different reality was shaping the global market. Britain had developed a voracious appetite for a new material, cotton. They called it white gold. It was light, washable, and comfortable, perfect for a changing society. But there was a problem. Britain could not produce it. At this time, the undisputed masters of textiles were not the British, but the artisans of India. For centuries, Indian weavers had produced cotton fabrics of such delicate quality and vibrant design that no European hand could match them. Not only was Indian cloth superior, but their labor costs were significantly lower, sometimes 5 times cheaper than in Britain. This created an economic crisis for the British wool merchants. The market was flooded with beautiful, affordable Indian calicos, and the domestic wool industry faced ruin. The British government, desperate to protect its traditional economy, responded not with innovation, but with law. They passed the Calico Acts in the early 18th century. These laws were protectionism in its purest form, designed to ban the import of printed cotton fabrics from India and force the British public to buy local wool and linen. The government believed that by closing the borders to competition, they could save the old way of life. But history is often driven by unintended consequences. The Calico Acts failed to kill the demand for cotton. The British public still wanted the fabric. They just couldn't buy it from India anymore. This created a massive, unfilled void in the market. The ban didn't stop the trade. It forced British entrepreneurs into a corner. They realized that if they couldn't import superior cotton, they had to manufacture it themselves. However, the old putting-out system was incapable of meeting this new demand. The hand spinners couldn't produce yarn fast enough for the weavers. It took nearly 8 spinners to supply a single weaver. This imbalance was a bottleneck that strangled potential growth. The pressure was building. The demand was limitless, but the supply was trapped in the fingers of cottage workers. The stage was set for a radical change. The ancient rhythm was about to break. The pressure on the British textile industry had reached a breaking point. The demand for cotton was insatiable, but the human hand had reached its physical limit. The solution would not come from the government or the aristocracy, but from the minds of practical men, tinkerers, clockmakers, and carpenters who looked at the slow, rhythmic motion of the cottage loom and saw a problem waiting to be solved. The first domino fell in 1733. A man named John Kay, a machinist from Lancashire, introduced a device that looked deceptively simple, the flying shuttle. Before this invention, a weaver had to pass the shuttle containing the thread through the loom threads by hand, catching it on the other side. It was a slow, repetitive motion that limited the width of the cloth to the span of a man's arms. Kay's invention changed the geometry of weaving. With the flick of a wrist, a weaver could now shoot the shuttle across the loom on wheels and catch it instantly on the other side. Suddenly, the width of the cloth was no longer limited by arm span, and the speed of weaving doubled almost overnight. It was a triumph of efficiency, but it created an immediate and severe crisis known as the yarn famine. The looms were now ravenous. They consumed yarn faster than the spinners could produce it. Remember, under the old system, it took up to 8 spinners to keep one weaver busy. With the flying shuttle, that number doubled. Weavers sat idle, waiting for yarn that didn't exist, while spinners worked until their fingers bled, unable to keep up. The bottleneck had shifted. The industry was unbalanced, and the pressure to innovate moved from the loom to the spinning wheel. For decades, this imbalance stifled production. It wasn't until the 1760s that a weaver and carpenter named James Hargreaves stumbled upon the answer. Legend has it that Hargreaves saw a spinning wheel knockover in his cottage. As it lay on its side, the wheel kept turning and the spindle continued to rotate. In that moment of accidental observation, he realized that if the spindle could be placed vertically, one wheel could turn not just one, but multiple spindles at once. He called his machine the spinning jenny. It was a wooden frame contraption that looked like a complex cage of wheels and threads. But its impact was revolutionary. A single worker, turning a single wheel, could now spin 8 threads simultaneously. Later versions would spin 16, then dozens. The spinning jenny was the first machine to truly break the limitation of the human hand in spinning. However, it was still small enough to fit into a cottage. It was a bridge between the old world and the new, keeping the work within the home, but multiplying the output of the family. But the true death knell of the cottage industry arrived with a man named Richard Arkwright. Arkwright was different. He was not just an inventor. He was a ruthless businessman with a vision for scale. He saw that machines like the jenny produced thread that was often weak and suitable only for the weft or filling of the cloth. He wanted a machine that could produce strong, tough yarn for the warp. His solution was the water frame. Unlike the jenny, this was not a machine for the home. It was massive, heavy, and complicated. It used rollers to stretch the cotton before spinning it, creating a thread of unprecedented strength. But its size meant it could not be powered by a human arm. It needed something stronger. It needed the relentless, driving force of nature itself. Arkwright had to move production out of the cottage and to the banks of rushing rivers. He built the world's first true cotton mill at Crompton. In doing so, he did not just invent a machine. He invented the modern factory. The workers no longer controlled their hours. They had to go to where the power was. The river did not sleep, and therefore, the machines did not sleep. The era of the putting-out system was ending. The era of industrial discipline had begun. Richard Arkwright had built the walls of the factory system, but the revolution was not yet complete. While the water frame produced strong yarn, it was coarse. It lacked the delicate finesse of the hand-spun Indian thread that British consumers so admired. The spinning jenny, conversely, produced fine thread, but it was weak and brittle. The industry was caught between strength and quality, waiting for a mind that could bridge the divide. That mind belonged to Samuel Crompton, a quiet, intense man who worked in the solitude of a crumbling mansion called Hall, I Teach Wood. In 1779, after years of tinkering in secret, he unveiled a machine that would become the workhorse of the entire global textile industry. He called it the spinning mule. The name was a nod to its nature. Just as a mule is the offspring of a horse and a donkey, Crompton's machine was a hybrid of Arkwright's water frame and Hargreaves' spinning jenny. It combined the roller drafting system of the former with the carriage stretching of the latter. The result was a masterpiece of engineering. The mule could spin thread that was both incredibly strong and impossibly fine. For the first time, British machines could not just match, but exceed the quality of the finest Indian muslins. The impact of the mule was instantaneous and explosive. It unlocked the final door to mass production. With high-quality yarn now available in unlimited quantities, the British textile industry did not just grow, it detonated. The statistics of this era are almost difficult to comprehend, representing a vertical line on the graph of human history. In 1750, before this mechanical trinity of the shuttle, the jenny, and the mule, Great Britain imported roughly 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton. By 1850, that number had skyrocketed to a staggering 588 million pounds. This was no longer just a trade. It was a planetary shift in resource consumption. The entire American South was transformed into a cotton plantation to feed the insatiable hunger of British machines. This explosion of production required a new kind of home. The scattered water mills along rural rivers were no longer enough. The industry needed a center, a beating heart where labor, capital, and transport converged. That heart was Manchester. Almost overnight, Manchester transformed from a modest market town into the first industrial city the world had ever seen. It earned a new name, Cottonopolis. It was a place of terrifying energy and scale. By the mid-19th century, the city boasted over 900 factories. These were not small workshops. They were cathedrals of industry, multi-story brick leviathans filled with the deafening roar of machinery. The landscape itself was rewritten. Visitors to Manchester described a city where the sun seemed to struggle to reach the ground. The sky was permanently bruised by the black smoke of coal fires, a man-made ceiling that hung over the streets. The air hummed with the vibration of thousands of spindles turning in unison. It was a sensory assault, the smell of sulfur, the noise of clattering gears, and the sight of a skyline dominated not by church spires, but by smoking chimneys. In Cottonopolis, the ancient rhythm of nature was finally and completely obliterated. The city did not sleep. Gas lighting allowed the mills to run deep into the night. A new civilization had risen, built on white gold and iron. But as the profits soared, a shadow began to lengthen over the people who kept the machines running. The cost of this cloth was about to be measured not in pounds sterling, but in human flesh. The rise of Cottonopolis brought with it a paradox. As the price of cloth fell, making fabric affordable for the masses, the human cost began to rise uncontrollably. This cost was not just felt in the blackened streets of Manchester, but across the oceans. The first casualty of British industrial efficiency was the very source of its inspiration, the Indian artisan. For centuries, the weavers of Bengal had produced the world's finest textiles. But not even their supreme skill could compete with the relentless speed of the spinning mule and the power loom. British machines produced cloth so cheaply that they eventually undersold the Indian masters in their own markets. An entire ancient industry was dismantled, leaving millions destitute. The white gold that built Manchester destroyed the livelihoods of the East. Back in Britain, life for the worker was undergoing a fundamental psychological shift. In the cottage, a weaver worked by the sun. If he wanted to rest, he rested. If the harvest needed tending, the loom stood silent. But in the factory, the sun was irrelevant. The work was dictated by the clock. This was a new kind of time, industrial time. The factory whistle replaced the rooster. Discipline was absolute. To be late was to be fined. To be slow was to be fired. The machines did not tire, and therefore, the humans attending them were not permitted to tire either. Shifts stretched to 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, in air thick with cotton dust that coated the lungs and shortened lives. Who manned these relentless machines? The factory owners found that they did not need the physical strength of grown men. In fact, they preferred workers who were cheaper, more docile, and possessed smaller, nimbler fingers. The Industrial Revolution was powered largely by the labor of unmarried women and, most tragically, children. Child labor was not a new invention. Children had always worked on farms or in the home. But the factory system stripped away the protective supervision of the parent and replaced it with the cold oversight of the foreman. The industrial system made child labor visible, organized, and grueling on a scale never seen before. Enter the factories of the early 19th century, and you would see children as young as 8 years old navigating the dangerous aisles. They were given specific, terrifying titles. There were the scavengers, small children whose job was to crawl underneath the spinning machinery while it was still moving. In the semi-darkness, amidst the deafening noise of clanking metal, they had to sweep up loose cotton and dust. One wrong move, one loose piece of clothing caught in a cog, could mean the loss of a limb or a life. Then there were the piecers. These children had to lean over the spinning frames to repair broken threads. Their tiny fingers had to be quick, tying knots in seconds to keep the production line moving. They were paid a pittance, sometimes only 10% of an adult's wage. Yet they were essential gears in the machine. They were the invisible army, an expendable fuel source for the engines of progress. As the output of cotton soared to astronomical heights, it was carried on the small, tired backs of a generation that grew up without a childhood. The sheer brutality of the early factory system, with its armies of exhausted children and hazardous machinery, eventually created a social pressure that could not be ignored. The sight of the dark, satanic mills, as the poets of the era called them, began to weigh on the national conscience. It became clear that the unbridled pursuit of profit was eating the nation's future alive. This profound social crisis led to the first significant government interventions in the workplace, the Factory Acts. These were not immediate, sweeping solutions, but rather the beginning of a long, slow battle to regulate the industrial machine. For the first time, laws were passed to limit the working hours of children and to set minimum ages for employment. It was the start of a gradual transition, moving the child from the dangerous factory floor to the schoolroom, acknowledging that a society could not build its wealth solely on the backs of its youngest members. Yet, history is rarely one-sided. While the textile boom inflicted misery on the working poor, it simultaneously birthed a vibrant, powerful new demographic, the middle class. Before the revolution, society was largely binary, aristocrats who owned the land and peasants who worked it. The industrial explosion shattered this ancient hierarchy. Suddenly, there was a growing population of men who fit neither category. They were the mill owners, the merchants, the bank clerks, the foremen, and the engineers. They were the managers of this new complexity. They did not inherit their wealth. They built it from coal, steam, and cotton. And with their new wealth, they demanded a new way of life. These industrial elites moved out of the smoke-choked city centers to the leafy suburbs, building comfortable brick homes filled with goods that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. Their parlors were adorned with carpets and mirrors. They became the drivers of a consumer revolution. The textile boom had lowered the cost of goods so significantly that luxury became accessible. Items that were once the exclusive preserve of the aristocracy, sugar, coffee, tea, and fine ceramics, began to appear on the tables of the middle class. A famous example was Wedgwood china. Josiah Wedgwood, a master potter and marketing genius, used the industrial techniques of division of labor to mass-produce high-quality pottery. Suddenly, the aspiring middle class could dine off plates that looked like those of the nobility. This new class was ambitious, literate, and politically active. They believed in progress, science, and the power of the individual. They were the beneficiaries of the cotton boom, and their rising standard of living stood in stark contrast to the slums just a few miles away. The textile industry had cracked British society open, creating a ladder of immense opportunity for some, while digging a pit of despair for others. And as this new class grew, so did their demand for speed. The canals and rivers were no longer enough to move their goods. The world was ready for the next great leap in connectivity. As the mills of Manchester churned out miles of cloth, a logistical nightmare emerged. The ancient infrastructure of Britain was crumbling under the weight of its own success. The muddy, rutted roads that had served medieval farmers were hopelessly inadequate for the heavy commerce of the industrial age. A single horse could only pull a limited weight on a cart, struggling through the mire of a rainy English winter. Cotton bales sat waiting. Coal delivery was sluggish. The revolution needed new arteries to survive. The first answer was water. This was the dawn of the golden age of canals. Engineers began to slice through the countryside, digging artificial rivers that defied the natural landscape. High-profile projects, like the Bridgewater Canal, proved the concept with undeniable math. They demonstrated that a single horse pulling a barge along a calm, frictionless channel could move tens of times more weight than it could drag on a road. The economic impact was immediate and staggering. The price of coal in major industrial centers dropped by half almost overnight. This success inspired a frenzy known as canal mania. A web of silent, efficient waterways spread across the nation, linking the coal mines to the factories and the factories to the markets. For a moment, it seemed that the future belonged to the barge. But water had limits. It could freeze in the winter, dry up in the summer, and fundamentally, it was slow. The textile barons, now wealthy and ambitious, demanded speed. They looked at the steam engines pumping their mines and powering their looms and asked a radical question. What if we put the engine on wheels? This was the birth of the railway, the iron spine of the modern world. It was made possible by the convergence of three specific industrial triumphs: cheap puddled iron for the rails, the rolling mill to shape them, and the high-pressure steam engine. Innovators like Richard Trevithick and George Stephenson took these disparate elements and turned them into a machine that breathed fire and ate distance. The defining moment for the textile industry arrived with the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. This was not just a track, it was a strategic lifeline. It connected Manchester, the smoking engine of production, directly with Liverpool, the global port where raw American cotton arrived and finished cloth departed for the empire. When a steam locomotive rocket thundered down that track, it signaled the end of the old world geography. Passengers and goods could now travel between cities in hours instead of days. The railway annihilated the isolation of rural life, allowed ideas to spread at the speed of steam, and accelerated the textile boom to a velocity that was previously physically impossible. The world was shrinking, and the pace of life was accelerating to match the spinning of the gears. The revolution that began in the damp valleys of Lancashire could not be contained by the shores of an island. The power of steam, having conquered the land with the railway, now turned its gaze to the oceans. While the textile mills produced cloth at a frantic pace, the final piece of the puzzle was delivery. The world's oceans had always been ruled by the wind, forcing merchants to wait for the capricious nature of the weather. But the arrival of the steamship changed the geometry of the globe. Suddenly, global trade was no longer a gamble. It was a schedule. A cotton merchant in Liverpool could now track the arrival of raw materials from the American South or the shipment of finished shirts to India with mathematical precision. The world was shrinking. The vast distances that had once separated nations were collapsing under the relentless churn of the paddle wheel and the screw propeller. Great Britain, sitting at the center of this new web, understood the immense power it held. It possessed the keys to the kingdom, the blueprints for the spinning mule, the power loom, and the Watt steam engine. The government, terrified of losing its industrial supremacy, attempted to lock these secrets inside the country. Laws were passed forbidding the export of textile machinery. Skilled workers and engineers were banned from emigrating, effectively prisoners of their own knowledge. But ideas like steam build pressure until they find a release. The fire of industry was too hot to contain. British entrepreneurs, driven by profit, were eager to sell their expertise abroad, and foreign nations were desperate to catch up. The industrial virus began to spread. Belgium was the first to fall, transforming rapidly thanks to its own rich deposits of coal, mirroring the landscape of northern England. But the most significant leap occurred across the Atlantic. In the United States, the revolution took on a new, distinctly American flavor. It began with industrial espionage. Men like Samuel Slater, an apprentice of Arkwright, memorized the designs of the British machines and fled to America in disguise. He carried the secrets of the textile mill in his mind, rebuilding them on Rhode Island soil. However, the Americans did not just copy, they innovated. They developed the American system of manufacturing, characterized by interchangeable parts. Instead of crafting each mechanism by hand, machines produced identical components that could be swapped and assembled rapidly. This was the precursor to the assembly line. In textile cities like Lowell, Massachusetts, massive integrated mills rose up, processing raw cotton into finished printed cloth under a single roof, something even the British had rarely achieved. Germany, too, awakened. Initially a patchwork of fractured states, the arrival of the railway and the need for steel to build it acted as a catalyst for unification. By the time the German states coalesced, they had built a heavy industry in the Ruhr Valley that would soon rival Britain itself. The textile boom had started a race that every major power felt compelled to run. The machines were no longer just British. They were the new universal language of power. By the middle of the 19th century, the first industrial revolution, the era defined by the frantic spinning of cotton, the clanging of iron, and the hissing of steam, had reached maturity. The textile boom had done its work. It had broken the ancient mold of human life. But the momentum of progress is a heavy thing. Once it begins to roll, it cannot be easily stopped. As the Victorian era progressed, a second wave was already forming on the horizon. This new wave would not be built on the back of the textile mill. It would be defined by new gods, steel, chemicals, and electricity. The invention of the Bessemer process unleashed the mass production of steel, a material stronger and more flexible than the brittle iron of the past. This allowed for the construction of skyscrapers that pierced the clouds and giant industrial corporations that spanned continents. Simultaneously, the world began to move away from the simple burning of coal. Petroleum emerged from the earth, and with it, the internal combustion engine, opening the door for the automotive industry. But perhaps the most profound shift was the arrival of electricity. The gas lights that had allowed the cotton mills to run late into the night were replaced by the harsh, brilliant glare of the electric bulb. The grid was born. The rhythm of the city became permanent, operating 24 hours a day, totally divorced from the rising and setting of the sun. The relentless efficiency of the factories meant that goods were piling up faster than they could be sold. Shopping transformed from a necessity into a leisure activity. Grand department stores opened their doors, offering a dizzying array of products to the new urban elite. The world was now connected by the electrical telegraph, allowing information to travel instantly, and literature for the masses circulated on an unprecedented scale. Looking back, the explosion of the textile industry in the 18th century was arguably the most significant event in human history since the invention of agriculture. It broke the Malthusian trap, allowing income and population to undergo sustained growth for the first time. It shifted the economic center of gravity from the east to the west and created the modern global economy. But this progress came with a heavy price. The landscape of the planet was irrevocably changed. The quiet green fields and clean rivers of the past were replaced by grid-patterned cities, smoking chimneys, and iron arteries. The environment began to bear the scars of our advancement, leaving us with the environmental shadows that we still grapple with today. We are the direct descendants of that first coal-fired spark in Lancashire. The legacy of the flying shuttle and the spinning jenny is embedded in the very DNA of our modern lives. The textile boom didn't just clothe the world, it redefined what it means to be human. It shifted us from a species that followed the slow, forgiving rhythm of the seasons to one that demands the world move at the speed of a machine. We have inherited a world of boundless convenience and breathtaking speed, all born from a moment a simple weaver decided he needed to work a little faster.